There's a tendency for progressives to believe that we can fix the many problems with our society in the framework of said society, that we just need younger people, more women, more people of color, better political parties, more regulation, more democracy. It's a common attitude, even amongst young people, that participating in current mainstream politics, rising the ranks, is how you go about changing the world. And sure, you might win some things, and maybe even a lot of things, but ultimately, this perspective is very limiting. We are not above nor beyond our surroundings, our material conditions. To keep acting as such and not to radically break from existing norms and values will only mean humanity's downfall. In order to understand the many problems with our current society, we have to understand its building blocks. At the core of everything in our lives, before we get to any of the bigger, broader things like culture, is how our society meets people's needs and wants. That's a material question, it's an economic question. Nothing in our society works unless we first sort out what is produced, when it's produced, where it's produced, how it's produced, and who it goes to. So, what actually is the capitalist mode of production? Outside of any ideology, we can understand capitalism to be human activity organized for the production of value, whereby two classes emerge, an owning class and a working class. The owning class owns, hence the name, the property, the business, the firms, the equipment, the capital needed to produce what society needs and wants. And the working class works at those businesses, operates that equipment, sells their labor to that owning class, and they're paid a wage. This doesn't mean that, classes are monolithic. In fact, it's, for example, the owner classes' shared interest in generating profit, which drives them to compete and clash with each other. Now, you can move in between them. Someone can own a lot of property, for example, while still working a job. So think of it less about your personal character or status and more about your relationship to how things are made and distributed in our economy and society. The things we produce in society have what's called use values, that being how useful they are to society, their utility, and they have an exchange value, that being their quantitative value, so how much you can exchange one good for another. The latter is what the capitalist mode of production is particularly interested in. As the class that owns businesses, they're looking to sell products onto a market to make a profit. These businesses compete on a market to sell products or commodities to consumers like you and I. Thus, at the center of our society, our economy, politics, everything, there are two fundamental questions that keep coming up, one of production and one of nature. How do we make things to satisfy people's needs and wants, given the environment around us? From these fundamental problems, more social things or superstructural stuff like culture or governance arise. We see this in early human history. The affirmation of what we would call states typically came about in conditions where good land was scarce, where elites were environmentally circumscribed. Even within societies, different forms of, for example, farming methods cultivated different cultures. In their book Fossil Capital, Andreas Malm documents that actually steam engines and coal weren't adopted because they were technically more viable or because it was cheaper. In fact, coal was adopted over other energy sources, namely water, in spite of the fact that water was more abundant, cheaper, and communal. Conversely, coal was an easily dispatchable, portable energy source which could be brought into urban areas where the supply of labor was high and early industrialists had their property rights protected. With the stock as a power at their command, capitalists inflated their power vis-a-vis workers. Capital became more powerful in both senses of the term, as in a powerful explosion and a powerful proprietor. By dint of their exceptional purchasing power, capitalists could buy steam engines and coal alongside slices of human lives over which they could then exercise reinforced power on the shop floor. Specifically, the adoption of coal was used as an antagonist to labor, enabling the capitalists to defeat the 1820s revolts, which threatened to drive the infant factory system into crisis. In the drawn-out confrontation over that system, labor lost to capital. In a disaster Marx considers typical, the substitution of the steam engine for man strikes the final blow in this, as in all similar processes of transformation. What we see here are the contradictions born from capitalism of nature and labor meeting. Capitalism has an insatiable appetite for accumulating. Competition between businesses drives them to find more resources, more labor, expand production, and sell more stuff. This, of course, particularly the finding more resources part, comes into direct conflict with the limits of nature. Since the Earth is finite, it is obvious that there are biophysical limits to capital accumulation. Despite knowing this, capital is incapable of limiting itself. On the contrary, capital constantly attempts to overcome these limits, only to increase its own destructiveness against society and nature. That first part is called the formal subsumption of nature, which in basic terms is when a business goes out and finds resources to then fashion them into something to sell. So for example, panning for gold and selling it. The latter part is called the real subsumption of nature, which is basically manipulating biological processes with the aid of technologies so that nature is remade to work harder, faster, and better for the purposes of selling more stuff. So, for example, surface mining operations like open cut mining, using these huge machines to completely transform the environment and gear it towards commodity production and accumulation. As capitalism develops nature, it moves more from formal subsumption towards real subsumption as it tries to overcome the various natural barriers of a planet with finite resources and intricate ecosystems. Thus, the real barrier of capitalist production is capital itself. This is true for that other thing mentioned before, that of labor, production. At the base of society, that being how things are produced, there is a contradictory relationship or a conflict between worker and owner, between labor and capital. You, someone with a job, work a bunch of hours and you're paid a wage for it. You have an interest in wanting a higher wage, work less hours, and have the best and safest conditions at work. Now, all else equal, these interests cut into the owner of the company's profits. All else equal, if they were to pay you more, reduce your hours, and touch up everything at the site to your personal liking, that'd cost them a bunch of time and, importantly, money that'd otherwise be a profit for them and the company. And because companies are incentivized by capitalism to compete and continually expand production, make more profit, the owner is likewise incentivized to not want to spend the money to increase your wages or better your conditions, and if anything, wants the opposite. Typically, the business owner gets their way as they own the business, it's their private property, they don't just have the money, but the ability to dictate where that money goes, what's produced, who produces what, and thus have all the power. And if you're unhappy with that arrangement, the boss can just let you go and find someone more willing and unemployed. Now, there are clarifications to this dynamic that I should make. Firstly, there are instances where the mutual growth in wages and profits is possible. For example, when productivity likewise increases. This is why earlier I stipulated that this contradiction of interest arises when all else is equal. So when you control for those extraneous variables like increases in productivity, think of it more as a fundamental core interest rather than what actually happens in the macroeconomy. Secondly, in our contemporary economies, this dynamic, while still there, is a bit blurred and hazy. Many firms nowadays have extensive middle and upper management who, while technically are paid a wage or a salary under that same arrangement, nonetheless are more proximate to the top of the company in terms of authority and power. Many companies nowadays have more complex forms of leadership and ownership, so you may have CEOs, CFOs, COOs, you've got a board of directors with executives and chairs, you've got shareholders who are investors that buy shares or portions of a company which the board has to act in the interest of, so it's a bit more complex nowadays, but fundamentally this dynamic, even if a bit blurred, remains. Let's go back a bit to the shift towards coal. The adoption of coal as a fuel source is emblematic of this self-induced barrier that we talked about. Initially used because it stabilized commodity production, that being making things for a profit, investment quickly moved to subsume nature in the real sense, to accumulate as much coal as possible, to continue fueling the Industrial Revolution and early capitalism. It was also used as a way to subsume, in the real sense, labor. If we go back to this understanding of subsumption, the formal subsumption of of labor refers to bringing people in to produce stuff appropriated by capitalism, and the real subsumption of labor refers to changing and rearranging how we produce things to make it more efficient and profitable. If formal subsumption was someone doing manual work for a wage, real subsumption would be replacing that person through automation, making the worker less integral and central to the production process. In this sense, the advent of coal and steam engines was a powerful tool of real subsumption, marking the defeat of the 1820s revolts and therefore stable production and accumulation. Real subsumption therefore works at marginalizing disruptive working people who kick up a fuss at work, and is great at transforming nature when existing natural boundaries aren't conducive to capitalism's needs. However, by constantly trying to innovate and expand its way out of these contradictions and barriers, as mentioned, the real barrier of capitalist production becomes capital itself. The burning of fossil fuels is intrinsic to the logic of capitalism, an easily dispatchable commodity that enforces deep divisions of labor, acting to subsume the labor process in real terms. Increasingly, there's been a glaring problem with the continual and exponential burning of fossil fuels, a barrier that we, in all likelihood, will fail to overcome: anthropogenic climate change.
Turning gears now, rapid changes in the coldest place on Earth could have dangerous consequences for years to come and thousands of miles away. In a new study, experts warn abrupt and potentially irreversible environmental shifts in Antarctica.
But as our climate warms, a possibly even deadlier heat is on the rise.
It doesn't matter how breezy it is. It doesn't matter how much shade you're under. It doesn't matter how much water you're drinking.
These are extreme ecosystems.
Across the political spectrum, from conservatives to liberals to democratic socialists, many believe it is possible to decouple or disentangle capitalist economic growth and carbon emissions from fossil fuels. However, this increasingly just seems out of reach. According to the IPCC, absolute decoupling is not sufficient to avoid consuming the remaining CO2 emission budget under the global warming limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius and avoid climate breakdown. Even if all countries decouple in absolute terms, this might not still be sufficient and thus can only serve as one of the indicators and steps towards fully decarbonizing the economy and society. It is this nexus of capital accumulation seeking to exceed nature's limits and its logic embedded in fossil fuel production which makes absolute decoupling impossible in a reasonable time frame. In the same frame, the superstructure, or everything in society, evolves to justify and solidify the base, that being production, you and your boss. Within that superstructure emerges a force that is dedicated to retaining and strengthening the role and presence of fossil fuel capital, for the energy that comes from fossil fuels is key to the production process. And we see this in what Eckbert et al. Calls the denial machine. This denial machine, consisting of fossil fuel industry money, knowledge brokers, corrupt scientists, and a media ecosystem, affected the public and politicians alike and has been one of the best organized and economically strongest propaganda apparatuses. There is a simple reason this lobbying machinery has been so powerful. In front of these giants and their well-greased media-savvy PR apparatus, science ended up disadvantaged when in terms of fighting for the attention of voters and decision makers. To try and disentangle or decouple the superstructural role the fossil fuel lobby plays in maintaining the current capitalist mode of production is folly. It is true that this new trend of green capitalism, green growth, a Green New Deal is a sort of solution proposed by those still optimistic that we can address climate change sufficiently in our current framework. After all, capital constantly invents new technologies, develops means of transportation, discovers new use values, and expands markets to overcome natural limits.
The capital can always shift this contradiction to somewhere else. The one easy solution is a new technology. So basically, when the soil gets exhausted under capitalist agriculture, they will introduce chemical fertilizer, for example. But this chemical fertilizer is often produced by using fossil fuels, which leads to another problem like climate change. So the problem is capital can use those technological shift in order to solve the soil exhaustion, for example, but it can only shift it to somewhere else by creating a new problem like climate change.
However, capitalism remains at odds with natural limits, for there are just some we can't overcome, irreparable even to its own innovations, and we see that documented by the IPCC's bleak yet expected reporting, suggesting that green growth is simply infeasible. Karl Marx, spooky, I know, Karl Marx said in the opening line to the Communist Manifesto that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. But what does this actually mean? The inception of the capitalist mode of production constituted the formal subsumption of labor. This meant that people from the countryside were brought into industrial areas to work long, grueling hours. These working people then began to form unions to try and collectively win less hours, better conditions, and more pay. Remember, workers have a fundamental interest in the social relations of capitalism to want these things, and their boss don't want these things. And across the board, unions slowly over time, in spite of attempts of criminalization and state repression, successfully did so. Thus, the emergence of working class organization and its demands in the 19th century was something capitalism had to reckon with. So a way in which capital did so was to bring industrial relations into its sphere of domination. And this came in the form of formalized legal collective bargaining, open collaboration between unions, the state, and business, but also social wages needed to maintain and reproduce a workforce, so healthcare and welfare guaranteed by the state, for example. Throughout the early to mid 20th century, the relationship between the working class and owner class became institutionalized, integrated into how society worked and how we produce things. This integration underpinned the real subsumption of labor, whereby new technology and managerial techniques transformed workplaces into being maximally productive, as the owner class had to find ways to make up for the losses incurred in concessions to the union movement. So instead of having a guy work for 12 hours a day and then sleep at the factory, he could work for 8 hours a day, have more machinery, be better rested, and be taken care of if he had an injury or gotten sick, and this would make workers, the working class, more productive. And this arrangement, this managed integration, worked particularly well post-World War II in what we now know as the golden age of capitalism, as the post-World War II boom. And yeah, this boom lasted for over 2 decades. However, this arrangement only remains viable so long as the rate of profit continually grows. In the long run, this configuration of the class relation proves unsustainable. The tendency of the overaccumulation of capital would seem to reassert itself on a world scale by the end of the 1960s and early 1970s. And it would be this overextension which would re-expose the contradictory relationship between labor and capital, between worker and owner, which of course remained irreconcilable. And as just mentioned, this came to a head in the late 1960s and early 70s. To quote the then president of the US Chamber of Commerce, "I must report to you that there is more fear, genuine fear and concern about the survival of our system today than any time in my memory. I said earlier, there are many people in this country who are against capitalism." Protests, riots, strikes were on the rise, and concurrently, the rate of profit was falling. More fundamentally though, the high point of this cycle of struggles, the revolutionary overcoming of capital, is posed contradictorily as both the generalization of proletarian autonomy and its capacity to dictate the terms of social reproduction, and as the refusal of work and of the condition of worker. So working people became more autonomous, captured more of their workplaces, grew in power, yet also negated themselves as a class through striking in perpetuity. They simultaneously affirmed their power, but also began to destroy what made them a class, that being subjugated in a social relation to the capitalist. Combined with the internal crisis, the global economic system was put into crisis after the largest oil producers in the world came together and nationalized their oil facilities, barring the West from accessing their resources. The leading figures associated with OPEC's establishment were deeply influenced and embedded in the radical anti-colonial movements of the period and held firmly to a vision of oil wealth as a tool to reverse centuries of colonial predation.
People really felt that they didn't quite understand how the economy worked anymore. And one particular example of this was that we saw unemployment and inflation rising at the same time. And that was something that should have been quite impossible.
Post-war Keynesianism, social democracy, mixed market economies, mediated integration, whatever you want to call it, was unable to resolve these fundamental questions, contradictions, and conflicts at the heart of capitalism. And so with the rate of profit in a free fall, with the economy stagnating yet inflation running rampant, with both business and workers highly organized and militant, something had to change. As pointed out in the literature, the capitalist class mobilized politically in the 1970s, like how the working class mobilized into unions to collectively bargain, protest, and even drive political demands. The owning class, capitalists, also organized as a direct counter. Because the owning class, well, owned things, they own the companies, the machinery, the property which produce goods and services, they have a lot of inherent bargaining and insider power with respective governments. Political parties and bureaucrats, no matter how reform-minded they were, nonetheless required a stable environment, a stable and profitable economy to do what they intended to do: govern. No matter how ambitious, fundamentally, when push comes to shove, those who govern are going to act in the interest of those who control the economy, for that determines stability and therefore their ability to govern and reform. We saw this here in Australia, for example. In 1972, our Labor Party was elected after decades in opposition, off the back of one of the largest and most potent strike waves. Yet as Whitlam's Labor government presided over capitalism in its deep crisis, it conservatized, falling into the most dramatic reversal in economic policy in the shortest possible time. Whitlam's economic advisor Barry Hughes describes the 1975 Australian Labor Party conference as a pro-business orgy. This was something that Whitlam seemed to be aware of, saying at the conference that it raises special difficulties for a democratic socialist party. We find ourselves now in a position of seeking ways of restoring profitability. We have to do that if we are to restore full employment. In realizing that mediated integration was increasingly untenable, that this standoffish, elevated form of class conflict denigrated the ability for capital to accumulate and generate profit, a new system was needed to destroy the power of labor and reassert the dominance of capital. We know of it today as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism can be defined as a state-centered hegemonic political project remaking capitalist production and social reproduction since the end of the long boom, shaped by a macroeconomic approach that sees inflation as a greater risk to economic development than unemployment and promotes the benefits of markets over state action. In breaking the fortress of an industrial working class, the relationship between classes was reshaped under neoliberalism. From being an integral part of the production process, organized labor became relegated and decoupled. Because a highly organized working class ended up posing an, at least ostensibly, existential threat to the then capitalist order, its restructuring required the decoupling, disentangling of workers from how the economy is arranged. The restructuring of the class relation has meant that the proletariat is in no position structurally to assert itself in its confrontation with capital, to tie real wage and productivity increases. This restructuring took on different forms in different countries. In the UK, employers under the Conservatives were not legally required to recognise or bargain with trade unions and can withdraw recognition previously granted, directly removing labour from how production and the economy is organised. Conversely, in countries like Australia, unions and their labour parties were at the vanguard of neoliberal transformation, for their conservative parties were too dysfunctional at the time for the task. Disintegrating organised worker power in Western economies meant a shift away from production and towards circulation as the primary engine of the economy. In advanced capitalist or post-industrial economies, growth has occurred primarily in industries involved with the circulation or realization of commodities, transport and retail, industries designed to manage the reproduction of capital, finance or labor, education, healthcare, and finally, industries concerned with the administration of flows of goods and bodies, information, technology, clerical work, and data processing. The economy has shifted from industries where unions have decent control over to industries where they don't. Governments and reserve banks also began taking a fundamentally different approach to employment, whereby they began to prioritize addressing inflation over employment levels. This gave birth to the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NAIRU, basically the lowest rate of unemployment which theoretically doesn't increase inflation. And, thinking back to high school econ, it gets presented pretty neutrally as a sort of matter of the fact thing, but thinking about it now, it's a pretty explicit argument against organized labor. Not to mention it's a completely arbitrary and arguably made up number, but the idea is that if there aren't enough people unemployed looking for jobs, then there is a lower supply of labor, meaning it's harder for a boss to fire a worker if they want to. That means workers have more leverage when negotiating, meaning they'd push for higher wages and better conditions, and the idea is that that's inflationary since you're pushing up the cost of business, what's called wage push inflation. Now, as mentioned on a micro level, it's not necessarily true, but on a bigger macro scale, when we're talking about when these two classes are organized and engaging in elevated class warfare, it's what we saw culminate in the 70s and 80s. So instead of trying to reach zero unemployment, the disintegration of organized labor from the production process has meant that those running the economy can structurally maintain a degree, let's say 5% of unemployment, which they consider desirable. This permanent stasis of unemployment in the economy makes it much harder for what's left of organized labor to recoup and bargain, for there's always another worker ready to go. And this has been exacerbated by making employment less permanent and more casual, temporary, and precarious. Post-industrial Western labor forces are much more casualized, meaning employment contracts are shorter, have less stipulations, less protection, less regulation, and theoretically means a greater degree of efficiency, as each individual worker is sort of their own agent entering and exiting the labor market. So because workers are so casualized and precarious nowadays, it not only makes it easier for bosses to sack workers who they don't need, want, or like, but also easier to fill those positions quickly, as everyone is moving more quickly and frequently through the labor market.
Credit growth 20% a year in Australia for the last 3 years of the 80s, twice the growth in the economy, pushing up the price of assets.
What signifies this shift to a more service-based, precarious economy that we know today was financialization. Financialization does not represent the escape of capital to the realm of finance in search of higher and possibly speculative profits. Financialization has indeed been characterized by the rapid growth of circulation compared to production. In fact, what has been most remarkable about the restoration of capital is the financialization of the capitalist class. Recycled surplus dollars, that being money unable to find profitable investment in the productive real economy, provided an enormous boost to global financial markets. This giant pool of money became the source of expanded state and consumer debt, as well as speculative financial bubbles. So instead of producing things at home, Western economies have increasingly become preoccupied with buying, selling, circulating goods and services that have already been produced, reproducing the capitalist mode of production in the form of services which disseminate and enforce the relations of production, and the capitalist class beginning to derive most of its wealth from speculative potential value of assets that they already own. It's why billionaires today aren't worth much on paper, it's all tied up in what the market evaluates their stock to be. Billionaires today are cash poor, as they say, and so if they want to spend money, they just borrow money based on the confidence of their stock portfolio. If they were to sell a large portion of their stock for liquid cash, the supply of shares would drastically spike, meaning prices fall and potentially causing a market crash. In essence, the period we know as neoliberal capitalism, late-stage capitalism, etc., is characterized by the disintegration or breaking away from organized labor as a part of arranging the economy and how we produce things, centralizing new sectors which abandon production in favor of circulation and reproduction, and the financialization of capitalism, which underpins this transformation and becomes the new primary form of wealth created and enjoyed by the ruling class. And this reorganization of the capitalist mode of production, which has reasserted the power of the owning class, disintegrating the role of labor in the economy, has meant that the logic of capitalism has penetrated every part of our lives. Combined with the inherent desire for capital to compete, accumulate, and expand into new horizons, new markets, and this explosive expansion in credit, labor becomes subsumed now in a totalizing sense. Every facet of society, our lives, becomes a market geared towards commodity production. You no longer just work a job and come home, you produce 24/7. Market logic is introduced into every bit of our lives. Our very thoughts and desires manifest into data which companies analyze, exchange, and use use to sell you more stuff without you even knowing. Speaking of companies finding and accessing your private data without you even knowing, this video is sponsored by Norton. Household financialization is associated with rising income inequality, but also with the retreat of public provision across a range of services, including housing, pensions, education, health, transport, and so on. In this context, the consumption of workers and others has become increasingly privatized and mediated by the financial system. For example, the savings for our retirement after our lives of working has become yet more fuel for investment vehicles. Superannuation and pension fund capital now play a significant role in the financialization of global economic activity worldwide. Its total value globally in 2019 was just over $50 trillion US. But despite all of the potential benefits, innovations, and improvements we've seen from neoliberal capitalism, we've seen that, like with social democracy, neoliberalism has been unable to mask the consequences of the many contradictions and conflicts embedded in the capitalist mode of production. In the first pages of his magnum opus, Marx writes about the dual nature of things produced under the capitalist mode of production. Let's take a shirt. The utility of a shirt, so wearing it, makes it a use value, and so use values become a reality only by use or consumption. Society may deem the work to make 5 shirts necessary, but 6 shirts might be too far, and so that last shirt loses its use value. Exchange value comparatively is a quantitative marker, something totally independent of their use value. And as Marx noted, the capitalist mode of production is, primarily at least, not interested in producing or doing things for their utility, their use value. Use values must therefore never be looked upon as the real aim of the capitalist. Neither must the profit on any single transaction. The restless, never-ending process of profit-making alone is what he aims at. And I think it's something that most people can agree on, that a lot of the time the profit of a few comes at the expense or doesn't align with the broader needs of society. The turn of the neoliberal period, as mentioned, unleashed finance in an unprecedented manner. Capitalism's main source of wealth has changed, from deriving profit from primarily producing things to deriving asset value from speculation. Speculation underpinned by an economy of rapidly circulating retailed goods and services. More than that, social reproduction, that being the processes by which societies maintain and perpetuate themselves over time, is captured by this new form of capitalism, transformed and geared towards commodity production. Whereas before, under managed integration, social reproduction was largely provided communally or by the state at the behest of capital. Now capital has total reign and domination over these spheres, for organized labor is disintegrated, decoupled from these processes. There are now whole industries around childcare, healthcare, etc. And even where these services are universalized by government, either the government merely subsidizes the market in doing so, or they own state-owned enterprises that are still run like a regular company. Most commercialized SOEs today more narrowly serve capitalist needs, such as stabilizing economic crises and advancing privatization, thus transforming public enterprise according to market logics. In permeating every sphere of life, disintegrating any sort of collective bargaining chip working people have, neoliberalism has perfected mute compulsion, whereby working people are disciplined not only by force or by propaganda, but increasingly because working people are transcendentally indebted to the economy. From the moment of your birth, you are shaped and prepared to go out into the world and work. You must do so and abide by the terms and conditions given to you. That's if you want to live a good, healthy, and happy life and pass that down to your kids. If you disobey, well, there's a line of many people waiting for your position, as again, structurally, the economy mandates a portion of the labor force as necessarily unemployed, in accordance with Nauru. And that flexibility for the employer is only exacerbated by the fact that the labor market is increasingly composed of informal, casualized workers. So you are compelled to abide by the system, to play the game, and there is no organized recourse to help manage the macroeconomy on your behalf as a class, to voice dissent which challenges this arrangement. This transcendental indebtedness isn't just limited to labor, of course, particularly given neoliberal capitalism is underpinned by large amounts of consumer, government, and investment debt. in capitalist economies where home ownership is relatively high, a majority, or at least plurality of the population, hold their biggest asset, a home, in part because they had to secure a large loan to acquire said asset. So by virtue of their home being their largest, most important asset, a significant portion of the working class are incentivized to want their assets to appreciate, which means perpetual substantial house price growth, necessarily locking out new aspiring home buyers. And as we saw in the global financial crisis, allowing such a large volume of real estate to devalue is a recipe for economic disaster. Paradoxically though, these kinds of crises produced by a situation where our whole economies, our labor force, our well-beings are being leveraged on debt is kind of desirable for the modern capitalist mode of production. Far from being intimidated by crisis, capital nowadays is working really hard to produce and experience it. Not long ago, crisis was something that arose unexpectedly or cyclically. Currently, crisis is a political method of managing and a political technique of government. Even just discursively, crises today are framed as corrections, as if we're just going in the wrong way and we need to bring everything down to course correct. The understanding of the crisis became important for capitalism because the crisis brings uncertainty, and uncertainty can only be contested through anticipation. Crisis provides a juncture point where capitalism can reinforce itself, as we know that crisis or market crashes are inevitable, and so capitalism gives rise to a production of subjectivity which tells us how we must respond to this order of things. It makes people act and think in certain ways. It fills the world with meanings that tell us how to behave. But what does that mean for the rest of us in reality? Sure, to say crisis is a mechanism to reinforce the capitalist mode of production is analytically sound, but what does it actually imply for the population? In James Joyce's Ulysses, the protagonist Leopold Bloom is the man who is so completely combined with himself and his alienation that it would be absurd to want to separate one from the other. This Bloom is the status of the modern individual. Individuals become neutralized, foreign spectators of their own lives, which is mediated by images and videos on algorithms. We have precarious jobs on short-term contracts with little protections, little community to go back to. Even our personal spaces of social reproduction, like our homes, are extracted. They're used to generate speculative value. As mentioned, you no longer just work a job and come home. You produce 24/7. Market logic is introduced into every bit of our lives. Our very thoughts and desires manifest into data which companies analyze, exchange, and use to sell you more stuff without you even knowing. Thus, we, outside of our capacity to sell our labor as employees, become living commodities, deprived of any use value we may have once had to society, only being used and viewed as an exchange value. And this precipitates the crisis of presence at the core of the modern day person under capitalism, and it will be its unraveling. Conjoined with the ecological crisis, there's only so much a system can perpetually innovate over, so much a system can click the reset button. Beyond the subjects in the imperial core, this empty opulence upheld by the expropriation and unequal exchange between global northern and global southern countries is itself characteristic of modern capitalism. Poverty in the midst of plenty and joyless affluence are but symptoms of a profound disorder, and it is the blood of the global south, the deprivation of the environment in these regions, which underpins this disorder. Over the past few years, this has culminated in the worst financial crisis ever in the global south, where we've seen the external debts and interest payments of low to middle income countries dramatically increase to historic levels. The neoliberal paradigm shift in the 1980s likewise saw an intensification of debt-fueled imperialism hanging over the global south. The period witnessed economic collapse under radical austerity programs, untold human suffering, and setbacks to human development, compounding intergenerational social and economic losses and environmental degradation as natural resources were sacrificed to the burdens of debt service. Capitalism, the planet, hell, even many of the well-off may survive the oncoming catastrophes, the crisis of presence, the ever-reliance on the global south, the ecological crash that is coming, but we won't, at least many of us won't. Many of our children and their children's children won't. The manufacturing of crisis as a means to solidify class, global, and environmental domination and inequality is an intended feature of the current mode of production. capitalism has been able to uplift the standard of living to an untold degree, innovate and expand beyond limits over and over. But at the same time, these innovations and expansions are at the very root of the existential problems facing our society and us as people. Class society will survive, the ruling class will survive. The question is whether we will. Moving beyond capitalism, therefore, is more than just a dialectical, analytical question. It is a normative one. Running back to social democracy, a time of mass political parties to manage capitalism in a better way, is ultimately running back to a system which produced the social crisis which gave birth to neoliberalism today. The reason why we're in our current period is because social democracy failed. It failed to mitigate elevated class conflicts, and by entrenching and solidifying the capitalist class as by virtue of seeking to manage and govern, it spelt the end of any sort of positive move forward. Likewise, trying to replicate previous movements in the current period where the working class is heterogeneous rather than homogeneous, a class which has little in common with itself other than its subjugation under capitalism, is likely not to succeed. Capitalism will produce its own juncture points, its own points of potential exposure. That much is inevitable. Its abolition, however, well, maybe not inevitable, but necessary.